Arizona Territory, 1877. The sun had barely cleared the ridgeline when the wagon train pulled out, and by the time the dust settled, she was already too far behind to catch up. Mara Densley's skirts were weighted with dust, her boots dragging through the dry sage as she tried to keep pace. Her breath came in short, hard bursts, and her legs ached from days of walking. She never had the strength the others did, never the speed, and when she stumbled over a half-buried rock and landed hard on her knees, the wagons didn't even slow. She pushed herself up, hands scraped raw, and watched the last wagon disappear over a hill they had left her behind. Again, she stood alone in the desert heat, her bonnet crooked, her skin burning. She had no rifle, barely any food, just the dented canteen in her satchel and the small cloth bag holding what little was hers. Her heart pounded louder than the wind in her ears. She had tried. God knew she had tried. Her legs trembled as she kept walking, not sure where she was going anymore. Just forward, one step, then the next. She had been traveling west with her cousin's family who had promised her a place in Oregon, but after a week of her slowing the pace, they'd grown short with her, snapping, muttering. Then this morning they just hitched up their horses and left while she was still washing her face in the creek. She had heard them. "She is too damn slow. She will get us all killed." She was not slow out of laziness. She had a burn on her left side from a kitchen fire when she was 12. It never healed quite right and the pain never went away, but she never complained. There was no point. By midday her lips were dry and her steps uneven. She stumbled again, this time onto her hands, and stayed there. She could not keep going. The heat pressed down like a weight, and the emptiness around her stretched on forever. Then, from behind her came the sound of hooves. She turned her head slowly, unsure if it was real. A single rider came up over the hill from the south, not from the wagon train. A man, tall in the saddle, moving with ease. His horse was a chestnut gelding, sturdy and dust-covered. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes, a rifle slung across his back, and a coiled rope at his saddle horn. Mara tried to stand, but her legs gave out again. He pulled up beside her and swung down. His boots hit the ground with a thud, and then he was kneeling beside her, reaching for his canteen. "You need water," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Here." She took it with shaking hands. The water was warm, but it felt like life itself. "Thank you," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. I got left behind. I saw the tracks, big group, they moved fast. I could not keep up." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded once, like that was all he needed to hear. "You hurt, just tired." She winced as she tried to shift. "And sore." He stood and offered his hand. "I am taking you out of this sun." She hesitated, staring at that rough, calloused hand. Then she took it. He helped her up easily, steadying her when she swayed. His hand stayed firm at her waist. "My name's Taren Ashby," he said, "was riding north toward Prescott, but I can change my heading. I am Mara Densley. You got anyone expecting you?" "No," she said quietly. "Not anymore. All right, then." He helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her. "Let us get you somewhere safe." They rode in silence for a while, the horse picking its way through the rocks. Taren kept one hand on the reins, the other lightly at her waist, steadying her. She felt the heat of his chest against her back, and for the first time in days she felt like she could breathe. He did not ask questions. He did not pity her. He just rode. By sundown they reached a small ridge where a cottonwood tree offered shade and a creek trickled nearby. Taren dismounted and helped her down gently, his hands careful. He unpacked his bedroll and set up a small fire, working quickly. Mara sat on the bedroll, watching him. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel less alone. He handed her a tin cup with beans and a strip of jerky. "Eat slow," he said. "Your body has been through hell." She nodded and did as he said. After they ate, he sat back, leaning on one elbow, watching the fire. "You are not slow," he said finally, her head turned toward him. "I saw your tracks. You were moving steady, just not fast enough for folks without patience." Mara looked down at her hands. "They said I was a burden. They were wrong." Silence hung between them, broken only by the fire crackling and the soft chirp of crickets. "You move just right to me," Taren said, her breath caught in her throat. She lifted her eyes to his, and he was not looking away. She did not know what to say. No one had ever said something like that to her before, not in all her 23 years. The fire lit the side of his face, his jaw dusted with stubble, his eyes steady and warm. He looked at her like she mattered, and in that moment something inside her started to breathe again. He leaned forward, slow and careful, and pressed a folded blanket behind her back. "You sleep," he said. "I will keep watch." "You do not have to." "I want to." She lay down, still watching him, and even though she was sore and afraid and still dust-covered, she felt safe. That night she slept without fear for the first time since she had left Missouri. And Taren Ashby sat by the fire, watching over her like she was the most important thing in the world. The next morning broke gray and cool, the sky layered in thin cloud that softened the light and eased the heat. A breeze moved through the cottonwood branches above, carrying the scent of damp earth and ash from the night's fire. Mara sat by the creek, sleeves rolled, rinsing out her kerchief. A thin line of steam rose off the water where it met the sun. Behind her, Taren was tending to the horse, checking the hooves and brushing down the gelding's flank with long, practiced strokes. He hadn't said much since sunrise, but his silence didn't feel distant. It was steady, like the hush before a storm that never came. Mara wrung the kerchief slow between her hands. "How far to Prescott?" "2 days if we ride straight," he answered, voice low like always. "But there's a trading post south of here. About a day and a half, fewer folks, but they keep supplies." She folded the kerchief across her lap. "I don't have coin." "I didn't ask if you did." She turned then, meeting his gaze for the first time since they woke. His eyes were darker in the morning light, less gold than yesterday, more like coffee cooled in a tin cup, but they held the same quiet insistence. "I won't be your burden, Taren. You're not. I was left behind because I slowed them down." "I know what you were told," he said, adjusting the stirrup leather, "but I seen the way you walked. You kept going until your legs gave out." "That don't look like weakness to me." She stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt. "Maybe it don't, but I still don't have coin." He didn't argue, just nodded toward the trail. "Let's ride." They moved south over low hills, the land opening into wide stretches of mesquite and thornbush. A pair of vultures circled overhead, drifting high and slow on the air currents. Mara sat in front, her back against Taren's chest, the sway of the horse settling into her bones. She hadn't realized how loud silence could be when it was full of thought. Around mid-afternoon, he guided the horse down into a dip where cottonwoods clustered beside a narrow wash. They dismounted, and Taren led the gelding to water while Mara sat beneath a tree, rubbing at the tightness in her calf. "I used to think Arizona would be flat," she said, pulling a pebble from her boot. "Like a griddle pan left out in the sun. Most folks do." He returned from the water, crouching near her, "But the land's got folds, quiet places. You just have to look for him." She watched him pour a handful of oats into a feed sack for the horse. "You ride alone much, mostly." "That by choice," he considered that a moment. "There's less trouble that way, but more quiet." He looked sideways at her, lips pressed in a line. "Sometimes quiet's what a man needs." She let that sit between them a moment. "If I knew how to ride proper, I wouldn't have slowed anyone down." He sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "You rode just fine yesterday. I just sat there. You stayed upright." "That's half of it." She glanced at him, uncertain if he was making fun, but his face held no teasing, just plain truth. He stood and offered his hand. "Let's fix the rest of it." She stared at his hand, then rose without taking it. "I can try." They spent an hour there, moving slow. Taren walked the horse in a circle while Mara practiced finding her seat. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight over dips and turns. He didn't crowd her, didn't take over, just talked her through each step calm and even. "You've got a good seat," he said, watching her circle wide. "You just never had someone take the time." She dismounted, breathing harder than she showed. "You always teach this gentle." No use shouting. Horse don't care for it neither. She smiled, faint but real. Your horse listens better than most men I've known. He chuckled, a low sound that rumbled in his chest. He's got better manners than most. They made camp by the wash that night. Taren caught a rabbit with his snare and cooked it over the fire, slicing equal portions without comment. Mara ate with her knees tucked up, watching the flames flicker across his face. He moved like someone who'd learned to make room for silence, who knew how not to fill it just to hear himself talk. She leaned back against a fallen log, her voice quieter than the wind. I was supposed to marry a man in Oregon. His fork paused midair. My cousin said he had land, that he needed a wife who didn't ask much. She stared into the fire. I think they meant to leave me before now, just didn't have the nerve till yesterday. He didn't try to fix it with words. After a moment, he reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. Found this near a prospector's camp last month. Meant to toss it, but something kept me from it. He handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully. A drawing, simple and skilled, 2 horses standing nose to nose beneath a tree. I draw sometimes, he said, eyes on the fire, when it gets too quiet. She traced the pencil lines with one finger. You can keep it, he added. If you want. She folded it along the creases and tucked it into her satchel. Thank you. Their eyes met across the firelight, and something between them shifted, quiet and sure, like a river finding its true path after a long drought. Neither of them said anything more that night, but the silence was different now. It held weight and promise. They reached the trading post just past noon the next day. It sat low in a dry basin built from adobe and rock, its roof patched with rusted tin. A narrow corral held a few lean horses, and a wind-worn flag hung limp over the door. There were no crowds, just a mule tied in the shade and a boy asleep on a sack of oats. Taren tied off his gelding and offered Mara a hand down. She took it without hesitation this time, her grip firmer than before. Her dress was still travel-worn, hem-frayed, but she walked with her shoulders straighter, her steps more sure. Inside, the post smelled of leather, tobacco, and old wood. A man with a crooked nose leaned on the counter, sorting tin canisters. He looked up as they entered. Need feed and flour, Taren said, removing his hat, and something for the lady. The man's eyes slid to Mara, then back to Taren. She your wife? No, Taren said, voice level, but she's under my care. The man didn't press it, just nodded and turned toward the back shelves. Mara stepped closer to Taren, lowering her voice. You don't have to buy anything for me. I know, she glanced at the wall where a mirror hung cracked and clouded. I ain't looked proper in days. You ain't missed much, he said. You're still yourself. She turned to him at that, brows drawn. What's that mean? He looked straight at her. Means you don't need a mirror to know your worth. She didn't answer, but a quiet steadiness settled into her as she stepped away to look at a shelf of combs and sewing needles. The trader returned with a small bundle of supplies, which Taren paid for in coins worn smooth. Outside, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the hardpan. They sat beneath the porch awning while the horse drank from a trough. Mara opened a paper-wrapped parcel. Taren had handed her a fresh bar of soap, a length of calico cloth, and a tin comb. I ain't had a new comb since I was 17, she said, running her thumb along the edge. Broke the last one trying to fix a fence latch. Figure you deserve one that's yours alone. She folded the cloth carefully, setting it back in the parcel. Why are you kind to me? He didn't answer right away, just watched a crow hop along the roofline. Because I see you, he said. And I reckon you've gone too long without anyone doing that. Mara looked down at her hands, then back at him. You always talk plain like that, he gave a slow nod. Don't see the use in circling a thing. She breathed in slow, the wind lifting a strand of dust from her sleeve. You ever think about settling somewhere? Sometimes. He leaned back against a post. But I haven't found a place that felt worth staying for. She didn't speak, but her gaze lingered on him longer than it had before. They left the post before sundown, riding west through a stretch of low juniper hills. Mara rode behind again, but this time her hands rested lightly against his arms, not for balance, just contact. The wind was cooler now, dusk stretching across the land in bands of pink and bone. They made camp in a shallow gulch, ringed by scrub and boulders. Taren built the fire low between rocks, and Mara unwrapped the cloth he'd given her. Cutting it into strips, she began stitching into a pair of makeshift sleeves. "You know sewing?" he asked, handing her a threaded needle. "My ma was a seamstress in Springfield," she said. "Taught me to stretch a yard like it was 3. She's still there?" She passed. Her hands didn't pause. "Fever took her the spring after my 18th birthday. I'm sorry," she nodded once, not looking up. "I was supposed to take over her clients, but folks didn't want dresses from a girl with a limp." Taren stirred the fire with a stick. "Their loss." She looked up sharply, and he held her gaze. "You don't say things just to say them," she said. "No, then what are you saying now?" "I'm saying it's a good thing you were left behind," he said, voice quiet. "Otherwise I might never have found you." The wind moved through the gulch, brushing dry grass in soft waves. Mara set the cloth aside, her fingers still. "You mean that?" "I do." She looked at him a long time, then reached for her blanket and spread it beside his. That night, she lay close enough to feel the heat of him through the space between them. Neither of them spoke again, but her hand found his under the blanket and stayed there. Taren didn't pull away. The fire burned low, and above them, the stars came out one by one. The morning air was cold enough to sting bare skin, and the sun had yet to clear the edge of the hills when Mara woke. She sat up, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, and looked toward the ashes of the fire, where Taren was already crouched, coaxing a flame from what embers remained. He hadn't spoken yet, but she could tell by the way he moved that he'd been up a while. "You don't sleep much," she said. "Enough," he answered, feeding dry grass into the kindling. "Sleep don't come easy when you're used to watching for trouble." She pulled her sleeves down over her wrists. "You expect it to find us?" "No," he said, glancing at her. "But I don't trust peace that hasn't earned its place." She poured water from the canteen into the tin cup he'd left by her side. The ground beneath her was still damp from the night chill. "You ever stay in one place long enough to see a season change?" she asked. He nodded once. "Stayed through a winter in Silver Bell, tried working a copper vein. Got snowed in with 2 mules and a man who liked to talk about himself until I near lost my mind." Mara smiled faintly. "What made you leave?" Snow melted. "So did my patience." She tilted her head. "You always leave when the weather turns." "Only if I've got no reason to stay." She didn't answer right away. The fire caught, a small crackle rising as the flame steadied. Taren stood and brushed his hands clean. "We should reach the canyon rim by evening. There's a homestead out that way. Belongs to an older couple I knew from before. They might take us in for a few nights." Mara wrapped her blanket tighter. "You think they'd want company? They've got space, and kindness enough not to ask questions you don't want to answer." She nodded. "That sounds like a good place." They rode out after packing camp, the trail winding through dry ravines and stretches of wind-smoothed stone. Mara sat straighter in the saddle now, her hands light on the reins when Taren passed them to her. He let her lead for a while, offering small corrections only when she asked. When they paused at a narrow pass to water the horse, she leaned against a boulder and looked out across the open land below. "You always carry that sketchbook?" she asked. He blinked at the question, then pulled it from his saddlebag. "Most times." "Can I see?" He hesitated, then handed it over. She sat, turning the pages slowly. "Horses, mostly. A few campfires. A sprig of wild sage drawn in tight detail." She paused at one she hadn't expected, a woman's hands folded in her lap, the left one curled slightly at the edge. Not delicate, but steady. "Familiar, this is me," she said. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "It is. When did you draw it?" "First night." "After you fell asleep." Her fingers touched the edge of the page. "Why?" "'Cause I didn't want to forget what it looked like when you let yourself rest." She closed the sketchbook carefully, handing it back. Her voice was quiet. "No one's ever done that, not for me." Taren didn't speak. He just tucked the book away and checked the saddle cinch. By late afternoon, the land began to rise, sloping toward red rock and pine. The wind carried the scent of juniper, and the sky had taken on that soft gold that came before dusk. The trail narrowed, and soon they came to a gate built from 2 leaning posts and a length of rope. Taren dismounted and opened it, then led the horse through. "I met the Barlows 3 summers back," he said. "Helped their boy pull a wagon out of a wash. Never forgot their stew." Mara looked at the house ahead, small, built from hand-cut logs with smoke curling steady from the chimney. A woman in a red shawl stood on the porch, drying her hands on her apron. When she saw them, she waved once, then stepped into the yard. "Mr. Ashby," she called. "You're late by a year and a half." Taren smiled, the kind of smile that showed in his eyes more than anywhere else. "Couldn't find another wagon to rescue." Mara stayed quiet while he introduced her. The woman, Sarah Barlow, welcomed them with a warmth that needed no explanation. Inside, the house smelled of root vegetables and warm bread. There was a woven rug by the hearth and a pair of boots drying near the stove. Mara touched the doorframe as she stepped in, her fingers lingering on the smooth wood. "You'll stay the night," Sarah said. "And the one after, if you've got no pressing place to be." Taren looked to Mara. "That sound all right to you?" Mara answered without hesitation. "It does." Later, after supper, they sat on the back porch beneath a sky so clear it felt like the stars might reach down and touch them. "I never pictured myself out here," Mara said. "Not like this, not with someone who sees me." Taren didn't reach for her hand. He didn't need to. "You're not just seen, Mara, you're known." She turned to him, her breath catching. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not unless you ask me to." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then you'd best learn what it means to stay. I've got a lot of quiet in me, but none of it's empty." He leaned in then, slow and certain, and kissed her once, gently. No rush, no question. Just the truth of it between them, and when she leaned into him, it wasn't out of need. It was choice. The kind you make when someone has already proven they'll walk beside you, no matter how slow the pace. The days passed without hurry. The Barlows' homestead offered a rhythm. Mara had never known chores that began with the sun and ended when the sky turned lavender. Meals taken with hands still warm from work, and quiet that didn't feel like emptiness, but like space being held. She and Taren stayed on after the second night, not because they had to, but because neither of them brought up leaving. Mara took to mending what she could for Sarah, stitching torn seams, ironing out stiff collars, patching the knees of trousers too worn for Sunday wear. Her hands moved with new steadiness, not from habit, but from the comfort of having something that needed her. Taren split fence rails with Isaac Barlow, who spoke little but nodded often. In the evenings, the men would sit on the porch steps, boots dusty and shirts damp with effort, while the women shelled beans or peeled apples at the table just inside. One evening, as twilight settled over the pines, Taren brought out a small wooden box, sanded smooth and fitted with a brass latch. "I made this a while back," he said, setting it before Mara on the porch rail. "Wasn't sure what for, but I kept it." She ran her fingers over the lid. "It's beautiful." He leaned against the post beside her, arms crossed. "Suppose I was waiting to give it to someone who'd fill it right." She lifted the latch and opened it. Inside, a length of cotton ribbon, a few folded sketches, and a brooch carved from bone. Simple things. Thoughtful things. At the bottom lay a scrap of paper with her name written in his hand. She looked up at him. "You've been thinking about this a while?" "I have." The next morning, Sarah brought Mara a folded bundle. "It was mine when I first came west," she said. "Wore it the day we staked our claim. Hasn't seen sun in some years, but I think it still holds." Mara unfolded it slowly, a linen dress the color of pale wheat, hand-stitched and worn soft with age, but clean and whole. She turned the fabric over in her hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, child. Just wear it when it's time." And when the time came, it was not announced with fanfare or witnessed by more than the Barlows and the wind through the trees. Taren stood beside her beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the pasture, his shirt pressed, his hair combed back with water from the pump. He did not speak vows that weren't his. He only offered his hand and said, "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Mara took his hand. "You already have." Isaac nodded once and said the words needed to bind them. Sarah placed a wildflower in Mara's hair, and they shared a meal of roast chicken and cornbread as dusk softened the sky. Later, when the others had gone inside and the lanterns had been blown out, Mara sat with her back against his chest, wrapped in a quilt, their fingers linked. "I never thought I'd belong somewhere," she said. "You don't belong to a place," he answered against her hair. "You belong with someone, that's different." She turned to face him, her voice steady. "I want to build something here, not just stay, build." He met her gaze. "Then we will." And they did. They took over an acre of the Barlow's lower field, with Isaac's help hauling timbers and Sarah's help tending seedlings. Mara grew squash and beans, spun her own thread from wool traded downriver, and sold mended garments to passers-by. Taren took work where it came, hauling, guiding, repairing leather, but always came home before the sun left the sky. They built a cabin with 2 rooms and a porch that looked west. On the first spring morning in their new home, Taren planted a cottonwood sapling near the door, its roots soaked with creek water and his own calloused hands. One summer evening, Mara brought out a folded blanket and spread it in the grass. She sat beside him as the sun dipped low, a small bundle in her arms wrapped in a cloth the color of new corn. Taren leaned forward, brushing a fingertip over the child's brow. "He's got your quiet," Mara smiled, tired and full. "And your strength." They named him Elias after no one in particular, just a name that felt like it might carry them through the years. Seasons passed. The cottonwood grew tall, its leaves rustling in the wind like whispered promises. Their son learned to walk beneath its shade, his first steps taken between 2 people who had once been strangers beneath a hot sky, left behind and found again. Mara never feared being forgotten after that. She was needed and known and loved in the steady way that held through storms. Taren never rode on alone again. He had found the place that was worth staying for and the woman who made it home, and so they stayed and they built and they lived together. Always.